Welcome back everybody to our studies in Tsarist and Communist Russia. In this video we're going to talk about opposition to the autocratic regime, looking at liberals, individuals and radical groups, and the Tsarist reaction. So we're going to be focusing specifically on, of course, Alexander II of Russia. When we think about opposition during this time period, we'll also touch on a little bit of Alexander III, although we'll get to that when we look at Alexander III in future videos, but also look at Nicholas II in the next topic, because of course we see even greater amounts of radical opposition, because of course we get a radical Russian Revolution in 1917. So, of course, he is often regarded, Alexander II, as the so-called reformist Tsar, due to his extensive domestic reforms and also the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. But his reign is also marked by significant opposition from all sides, really. We'll focus firstly on conservative and liberal opposition, and then spend a bit more time thinking about the radical opposition to the reign of Alexander II. So beginning first then, why was it the case that there was a broad conservative amount of opposition, or a broad amount of conservative opposition from, or in relation to Alexander II? Well, in terms of conservative opposition, we can see that there are a few areas in which we can identify the rationale for such opposition. You could talk about the fact that there was a weakening in autocracy, especially as the result of Alexander's reforms to the military, to the judiciary, to education and to local government, and also especially the emancipation of the serfs. These were all viewed by conservatives as a direct threat to the traditional structure of Russian society. Conservatives in this case then included the nobility, it included church officials, which we'll get to in a second, and it also included high-ranking members of military and civil administration who were investing in the existing system of autocracy and serfdom. And so the Emancipation Edict of 1861, which freed millions, up to 23 million serfs, was seen as an attack to the privileges of the social order that existed prior. And generally speaking, when there are radical reforms or just major changes within a particular structure and system of society, conservative groups will take issue with those reforms because conservatives are associated, or conservative groups are associated with conserving the status quo. And of course, when you have the reformist Tsar, that is Alexander II, doing all of the reforms, this is obviously going to present a challenge to the conservative groups. Furthermore, the Russian Orthodox Church, which was also a conservative institution, was also deeply intertwined within the autocratic state, and again viewed these reforms with suspicion. The Church feared that changes to the social structure and the expansion of secular education might undermine its authority. We noted in the previous lesson, for example, that there was education reforms and that there was an expansion of secular education, but for the most part the education system remained very, very religious, and that can be seen as a critique of some of the major reforms of the reformist Tsar. Although Alexander II himself was a personally devout Christian, he was willing to curtail church power in the name of modernization, especially in the domain of education and intellectual life. And so this brought conservative opposition from the perspective of the Russian Orthodox Church. And then finally, despite his reforms, you can see that Alexander II didn't really extend his reforms into political reforms to any great degree. You have local government reforms, which of course is one area where you do see a sort of political change. I guess you could argue that the Emancipation Edict was a political reform in one sense, but it was more of a social reform. And so the refusal to introduce things like a constitution or a parliamentary system, and therefore basically giving the illusion of reform with the local government and with military and with the judiciary, but while maintaining an autocratic structure within the Russian Empire, of course, rustled some feathers within the conservative group, but mostly rustled feathers within the liberal parts of society. So, for example, the Russian intelligentsia, the educated thinkers, the writers and the activists, they initially supported the early reforms of Alexander II, but were frustrated by the failure to grant political reforms, to extend political rights. Members of the intelligentsia, the liberal factions within Russian society, were hopeful that Alexander II would introduce reforms that could lead to a more democratic Russia. And the first sort of inkling of this potentially happening is, of course, the Zemstva reforms of 1864. This establishes local self-government and is seemingly a step towards liberalisation, but is also inefficient, seen as insufficient, should I say, by many liberals who wanted broader participation. The Zemstva system was controlled by the nobility for the most part. The nobility was at the heart and centre of each of these different Zemstva institutions. And so they and also was under the auspices of the central authority of the Tsar. Alexander II resisted calls for a national parliament, for constitutional reforms, for the creation of a more individual rights-based legal system. And so some of these reforms that were sort of illustrative of Alexander II's sort of perspective as a reformist Tsar were sort of seen as surface level. They were sort of milquetoast reforms. They weren't really striking to the heart of the socio-economic and political system that the Russian Empire existed under. They were sort of putting a plaster over a much deeper wound. And so ultimately, that's one of the reasons why we see this kind of opposition. Like, they were good reforms, they were pushing us in the right direction, but they don't go anywhere near far enough towards actually dealing with the problems, the issues of autocracy during this time. More dangerously then for Alexander II was the radical opposition. We see that the radical groups believed that the reforms under Alexander II, especially things like the emancipation of the serfs, were insufficient and failed fundamentally. The first of these were known as the nihilists, the nihilist group. Now, the nihilists were a group of intellectuals and students and radical thinkers who rejected traditional Russian values. This included things like authority to Orthodox Christianity, authority of the Tsar, and aristocratic privileges. Their name derived from the Latin term nihil, meaning nothing, which reflects their rejection of existing social, political, and religious structures. The nihilists then sought to replace the old order with a more rational and scientific society. And we see that the nihilist group emerges in response to the limitations of the reforms under Alexander II. And while Alexander II had introduced reforms like emancipation and some modest legal changes, many within the younger parts of society felt that they were inadequate. And so the nihilists believed that the reforms were too moderate and they were insufficient to dismantle the deeply entrenched autocratic system. And so they turned to radical tactics. They often engaged in direct action and violence, believing it was necessary to break oppressive structures. They were known for their various involvement, should I say, in various plots to assassinate government officials, including attempts on high-ranking members of the Tsarist regime, and also an attempt to assassinate Tsar Alexander II himself. There were many attempts by many of these different groups, but the nihilists were one such group that did attempt to assassinate Alexander II. However, ultimately, you would argue that this early group was their most significant contribution was their intellectual contribution to a wider radical movement. They didn't really do much in terms of massive social changes. It would be the next two groups that would be a lot more impactful in terms of radical opposition. The Neuronoki, for example, or the populist group was a far more radical group that was involved in a lot more direct action. So, the populists were a radical movement that emerged in the 1860s, particularly among, again, young revolutionaries, students, intellectuals. Some of the nihilist groups sort of would transfer into this populist group. Their central belief was that Russia's future lay in the hands of the peasantry, who they believe were the true bearers of revolutionary potential. They were inspired by a vision of communal living, and they saw the traditional peasant commune, sometimes known as the Mur, as the foundation of a new socialist society. The populists were ideologically opposed to the idea of a Western-style bourgeois society and believed that the Russian state could bypass the capitalist stage of development in history and move directly towards a socialist system by revolutionizing the peasant class. One of the most famous actions by the populists was a campaign, the campaign of Going to the People in 1874, during which hundreds of intellectuals, students and young radicals travelled to the countryside to attempt to inspire the peasants to revolt against aristocracy. But it should be noted that the Going to the People campaign was largely a failure. The peasants who were more concerned with the day-to-day survival and living and weary of educated outsiders were not very receptive to the revolutionary ideas of the populist movement, as you can probably imagine. And so following that failure, the failure of Going to the People, the populists began to believe that violent revolution could be the only thing to bring about change. And so this shift leads to the formation of more radical factions within this populist movement. One such example of radical factions was the Narodnya Volya, or the People's Will. This was the most extreme faction, and they began to advocate for the use of terrorist tactics to overthrow the Tsarist regime. And it's just so important that we now talk about the radical opposition. We talk about the People's Will. The People's Will was one of the most prominent and radical groups to emerge from the populist movement. It was founded in 1879 after the failure of the Going to the People campaign, and it became committed to the use of terrorism as a tool to achieve political change, violent opposition against political institutions. The group was deeply influenced by Marxism and but was more immediate in its goals. It wanted a rapid overthrow of the autocratic system rather than a sort of gradual societal change and transformation. And its most important and most famous illustrations of its power was the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. They assassinated Alexander II on the 13th of March 1881. This act was the culmination of years of plotting, as well as several failed attempts on his life prior. The group used a combination of explosive devices and skilled assassins to attack the Tsar, resulting in his death. So ultimately, what happened was that there were a number of attempts on his life prior to the 1881 assassination. There was a failed bombing, for example, in 1789, and so the People's Will, in failing to assassinate the Tsar prior, composed of dedicated revolutionaries, were willing to die for their cause, and so the assassination took place when a bomb or a grenade went off underneath the carriage of Alexander II as he was travelling back to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And the assassination marked the culmination of radical opposition to the reign, and it had profound consequences, leading to the intensification of repression under the successor of Alexander II, of course, who was Alexander III, who was a more conservative and authoritarian ruler. Finally, then, I want to just talk about a little bit about the sort of journey we're going to be going on into the future. And so while not initially a dominant force under Alexander II, Marxist and socialist revolutionary ideas do begin to influence the 1870s and more importantly the 1880s, 1890s, and going all the way into the 1900s. So we see that these were ideas that were imported into Russia by intellectuals who had studied in Europe. Essentially, although the Marxists did not achieve any kind of significant political power during Alexander's reign, their ideas are crucial for influencing the radical groups like the People's Will, for example, and the populists, but also for crucially developing and establishing later on in the century. So the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, for example, which later split into the Bolshevik and Menshevik factions, would begin to form in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And so you have to bear that in mind, to just keep the sort of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in the back of your mind. Even though they weren't too impactful during this period, they would get even more impactful as we go into Alexander III, Nicholas II, and then, of course, they're very impactful during the Russian Revolution.